Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter at VMSPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. You can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSpod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my monthly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSpod and patronize me. Now, I know I've said this a million times before. The really wonderful thing about this show is all the great people I get to meet and have wonderful conversations with. And this is one that is a very important show to me. Our guest this time around is Malcolm Margolin. He's the retiring publisher of Heyday Books out in Berkeley, California. We got connected by a pal of mine from St. John's College, Suzanne Vito. I put out a call on Facebook saying I am going to San Francisco and need suggestions for podcasts. And she said, "You have to interview Malcolm." And she was right on the money. I did need to meet Malcolm, and I did need to talk to him. Malcolm's a very special person, and I think you're going to get that from this conversation. And one of the things that's special about him is, this will sound weird, he has the uncanny ability to make me feel like I'm special. And that happened from the very beginning. And I was a little bit nervous because we had a very brusque phone conversation before getting together, and I was afraid he was going to be confrontational or something, and he turned out to be so warm and so embracing in conversation. In fact, when we finished up, he invited me to a reception at the Book Club of California that evening, which I'd never heard about, and went. It was on the way to a client dinner I had set for that night, and turned out to be this amazing library, really neat club, and I'm hoping to get back there my next trip to San Francisco. So that's another thing that I'm thankful for. Now, the one thing, there are several caveats about this episode, actually. One of them is that there is more about me than usual, and that is because Malcolm is a very curious person, and he's one of the few guests who's figured out that the difference between an interview and a conversation is when both people ask questions. And he started asking me things, and I just figured, let's roll and get going. He embraces story and storytelling, and he wants to hear other people's stories. And you guys who are listeners know that that's exactly why I'm doing this, to hear other people's stories and understand who they are and how they got that way. All the same, I'm hoping other guests don't figure this out, because ultimately you guys will realize I'm far more boring than you expect. I'm really not that interesting a person. Midway through the conversation, Malcolm tries to pronounce the name of an Indian professor and poet. I left it in, even though he stutters his way through it. I'm going to tell you now, her name is Chitra Divakaruni. See, I couldn't even pronounce it correctly. She's a professor at University of Houston, in the English department. So Chitra Divakaruni is the person who Malcolm's trying to name. The biggest issue and the biggest problem with this episode is that I screwed up. I did not start the main recorder. I thought I did. And when I went to stop it at the end of our conversation, it started. I was incredibly abashed and was desperately afraid that the backup did not record. Luckily it did, but I wasn't going to be back home for hours and hours, back to the hotel for hours and hours, because I had another show to do. So I had no way of checking to make sure that the backup did record, and I would have been humiliated had this episode not actually made it onto tape, as it were. Luckily it did. That said, the backup recorder is a Zoom H2, no external microphone, so it sounds a little different than a regular episode. I apologize, but thank God I had the backup going. because this conversation really meant a lot to me. And just listening back to it while I was editing, there were parts that brought me to tears. And, or as Malcolm puts it, I'm an emotion junkie. If I can go more than a few hours without breaking into tears, it's a wasted day. So that is Malcolm. He's retiring as the publisher of Heyday Books. He is 75 years old, has a wonderful and extensive history. There's a book about him that Heyday published called The Heyday of Malcolm Margolin, The Damn Good Times of a Fiercely Independent Publisher. You should read that. I read the first half of it on the flight over. It's really a lot of fun. Anyway, here is a bio for Malcolm. He does not have a website of his own, and there's not a strict bio on the Heyday Books site, so I'm going to use what's on Wikipedia. There's a more extensive one there, and I'm going to include that in the show notes page. Malcolm Margolin is an author, publisher, and the founder and executive editor of Heyday Books, an independent nonprofit publisher and cultural institution in Berkeley, California. In 1974, he founded Heyday with the publication of his book, The East Bay Out, an unauthorized guide to hiking, camping, swimming, and fishing in the East Bay regional parks. Malcolm is the author-editor of 8 books, including The Ohlone Way, Indian Life in the San Francisco-Monterey Bay Area, named by the San Francisco Chronicle as one of the 100 most important books of the 20th century by a Western writer. His essays and articles have appeared in a number of periodicals, including The Nation, Small Press, National Parks, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Los Angeles Times. He retired from his role as publisher at Heyday Books this year. And seriously, that doesn't capture a fraction of who he is. And, well, you're going to find out. Because now, it's the Virtual Memories conversation with Malcolm Margolin, already in progress, with an exchange about the novel Ransom by David Malouf, which is about Priam's visit to Achilles to retrieve the body of his son Hector. I started the backup recorder just a little bit late. Sorry.
Treading on the sacred ground is sacrilege or what?
Oh, no, to me, I mean...
I'm not sure whether Malouf's treading on this sacred ground is sacrilege.
I don't think so, because the tragedians came centuries after Homer, and they're retelling the stories, and they're tweaking it and turning it, and you could argue that they're just as disconnected from...
that's a great viewpoint. Yeah. That's a great perspective.
Yeah, that to me...
It's a living story.
Right. The myths have to be, retold. To me, I've read the Iliad 4 times now. And the first time was when I was in college. The fourth time I'd just turned 40. And it was that fourth time where I finally got Achilles as a person. Like, I used to just think petulant,
Yes.
two-dimensional. And it was only this last time that it hit me that he's got a son. Yes. And he knows he's never going to see him again. And he knows that he can see him again, but only by giving up all the glory that we already know he has. So that we know he becomes the center of the poem, that he gives it all up, that he gives up...
is that what's happening under there?
See, there's a part in book 9...
Do you have a son?
No, I don't have kids at all, which is why I'm able to sentimentalize people and their family. My take was, there's the scene where Odysseus and I think, I forget who the second one is, they go to ask Achilles to come.
Oh, yes.
And he starts talking about his fate, that he knows if he stays, he's never going to go home, but he's going to be celebrated forever. And the rest of them, when they go back to tell Agamemnon about it, they don't repeat that part at all. They repeat everything else word for word that Achilles says. And I think...
Oh, break my heart. That's beautiful.
Well, what I think is that they can't understand.
Yeah.
They literally, he's on another plane than they are.
Soldiers, and he's a human being.
Yeah, and that he sees time, and the rest of them just see, the war. He understands the greater implications.
What this book Ransom is about is Priam getting beyond his role of king into the role of father.
Yeah.
And approaching Achilles as a son and as a father. And it's getting beneath the staginess, and one of those poignant. So he decides to come to see Achilles not as a king, but as a person. And he takes his chariot driver. He dismisses his chariot driver. He sends to the market for an ox cart and a peasant. So he goes out with this peasant in the ox cart, and the peasant has no idea how to talk to a king. So the peasant is chatting away, and the peasant is telling him about how his son, who is now dead, had built an oven for his wife, and raised the oven up high so the wife wouldn't have to bend. He gave him some cakes that the wife had made. They come to a stream, they dip their feet in the stream, and Priam is thinking how much he's missed by being a king. These little bits of common life. He never thought about ovens. He never thought about how things were made. He's never dipped his feet in the stream. This real life had been kept from him. And he goes to Achilles with the sense of now he's going to embrace real life.
I've got to give it a read. That sounds fantastic. I mean, it puts me in mind of when Hector, comes back from the plane at one point and he sees his wife and child, and the child is screaming and screaming. He has to take the armor off for the kid to see, oh, you're my father. You're not some big scary monster.
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds
Hey, do you know Robert Bringhurst?
No.
So Robert Bringhurst is an essayist. The poet Bob Hass calls him the greatest essayist in the English language. And he wrote a book recently called Palatino. It was done by the Book Club of California, and it's on the typeface Palatino.
Yeah.
And he's an expert on typefaces. But he's also he's fluent in ancient Greek, he's fluent in Latin, but he also is fluent in the Haida Indian language. And I had him up at the Book Club of California recently with Gary Snyder and some others, and we had the most marvelous conversation on Haida mythology and Greek mythology and what lies behind it all.
Yeah.
It was my idea of heaven.
That's why I do this. Tomorrow is the biotech conference. Thursday is Congress. Today is, a couple of guys talking about books and their lives.
Yeah.
So what's retirement like?
Are we recording?
We're recording, yeah.
I'm getting used to it.
Yeah.
I'm getting used to it. And for a while, there was a sense of not knowing who I was without the inbox telling me. Mm-hmm. So for years, I've been a slave to the inbox, and I had my sense of identity in running this place. And I had my sense of identity being central and important to things. Suddenly being out of the loop was a little bit, it was disconcerting. And I thought that I had better resources to fall back on. But I think what got me into publishing was to attract beautiful women. and if you walk around, you'll notice that I've done this. And without, it wasn't a love of words. It wasn't a love of ideas. This was in back of it. There was something legitimate in back of it. But it was using this love of ideas, was using this love of words to create a world in which I could be important, in which I could attract people, in which I could impress people. And without anybody to impress except my wife and a couple of kids and some grandkids, I wasn't sure how to go on. Mm-hmm. So I flailed around for a while. And then I've just found my stride again. And it's the senses of a boat. Have you ever done any sailing?
Very, very little when I was a teenager, but yeah. So
every so often you're out there in the water and you're screwing around with the tiller and the winds are crossing you and the current is there and you're screwing around and you're trying to make headway. But every so often the thing seems to hit a groove and everything is right. The sail is right, the current is right, the wind is right. Everything is set, and you seem to be sliding along this groove without any friction, without any hesitation. And I finally have hit it again.
Yeah.
And it came about from losing that sense of importance. From losing, I find that being unimportant is a kind of liberation, and no longer walking around with the burdens of a small press is just marvelous. No longer having to worry about how to pay the rent. No longer having to worry about my finance committee, my auditing committee. No longer having to worry about authors and selling their books. That I can now get on with life. And I've been getting on with it.
And have you figured out a second act or third act or fourth act, however you want to count it? Or is it simply the act of living at this point?
No, it's not just the act of living. It's the act, I've got to be engaged. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that I'm going to retire to the
golf course.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah,
so, the metaphorical golf course. Yeah.
Hey, my second job was as a caddy at the Brookline Country Club. Yeah. My father used to introduce me as the only Jew in the Brookline Country Club.
The only way you could get into the place.
And the one time I was tempted to play golf was I got a call from Ron Turner at Last Gasp Comics that Crumb, the cartoonist, was coming in from Paris, and Griffith, the guy that did Zippy, the Pinhead, was coming in, and they needed a fourth to get stoned and play golf. And I said, I don't play golf. And I hung up realizing I just made the mistake of my life.
Oh my God! That at a minute, well, you wouldn't have remembered any of it, but it would have been a story you could have made up. Oh my gosh! But yeah, you're looking at a.
So what? I spent the weekend with. I did a Saturday night with Juan Felipe Herrera, the poet laureate. Do you know Juan Felipe?
No.
He's a complete zany. He's marvelous, and the fact that a guy with an FBI file like this could become poet laureate is amazing to me. And I'm not sure what his FBI file looks like. Maybe he's not. Maybe he didn't do as much as I think he did. But I remember him from the '60s and the '70s, and he was an out and out crazy. And he's got the most ebullient sense. This is not structured poetry from the mind. This is not structured poetry from the history of poetry. He picks it up like an antenna from the people and the things around him. So it's the poetry of everyday life, and it's the poetry of people's aspirations. And you end up with him, you feel that the world is alive, and that everybody around it is just hyper crazy and alive, and you yourself are crazy and alive. And there's a sense of joy to it all. There's a sense of abandon that I just love. So I had dinner with him on Saturday night. Last night, I ended up... Do you know who Bob Kaufman was? He was one of the beat poets.
Oh, yeah.
He's a black Jew. And so there was a film on Bob Kaufman, and my friend Al Young was the African-American poet. And so I ended up hanging around with people and thinking about that old beat generation, Jack Hirschman and Ferlinghetti and all those other folks. And it was just, and being able to enjoy these things, being able to enjoy these people, and being able to still on the outside, I can create things I could never create on the inside. So I think I'm going to create a project around Al Young where I want to create an oral history of his. He was in California. He was in California in the 50s and the 60s. He has a photographic memory. He was everywhere. He knew everybody, and I want to get his memories down. And I'm creating a project with the Book Club of California around publishing and book selling during the 1970s. And this was a time of absolute revolution. The whole Earth catalog came along. There was hippies came along. There was a sense of an alternative world. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll became big, and the major publishers didn't know how to handle it. The new age shit came along, and the major publishers didn't know how to handle it. There was a change in technology where people could now set their own type on these antiquated machines, on Mergenthalers and CompuGraphics. And when did you have your press?
Oh, I was late 90s, so I was already in Quark.
Yeah.
My thing was, I started in trade magazines in the mid-90s, and they'd already moved over at that point. And I thought, thank God, because if I had to do paste up, it would have looked like a magazine made by a serial killer. I mean, I just had the worst, hand-eye thing. It would have been absolutely terrible. So luckily, I was already there when it was digital. But,
Yeah. That old world was not as bad as you think it was. And the time saved is not as much as you think.
Yeah.
That I think... So what I want to do is as I pass this place along, I want to pass to other people some of that spirit that informed it. And it was partly to attract beautiful women, but that's at the root of all art.
Yeah.
And it was partly to... It was a playground, and it was a playground of high risk, and there were people around that could that develop publishing operations around their own personalities. So you'd end up having Alta had Shameless Hussy Press, and she was a shameless hussy.
Yeah.
And John Oliver Simon had Aldebaran books, and George Mattingly had Blue Cloud, and Don Cushman had Cloud Marauder. Ishmael Reed had I Read books. Jerry Ratch had Somber Reptiles Press. What a great name for a press, Somber Reptiles Press. This was not a corporate name.
Yeah.
You're not going to have somebody calling and saying,
I'm here with Somber Reptiles. Yeah.
Would you like to speak to our sales department? This is Somber Reptiles Press. and there was something about it that was so loose and so marvelous. And it's not that it's become stiff and corporate, because there's still that element of looseness in it. But there was something in what I'm passing on to people is not an economic engine. It's not an institute. What I'm passing on to people is something that I'm trying to define it.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to define what this legacy is. I think it's the capacity to have fun. And I think it's the capacity that you can have a life that you can build around not branding and not demands of the marketplace, but around what you really think and what you really want. And it can be a form of dance, it could be a form of costume. So I think that another thing that I'm going to be doing is I've spent 50 years among California Indians, and I want to write about what I've seen. And what I've seen in there has not been what other people have seen. I think there's a kind of dress code that I think that for ideas to get into the dominant culture, they have to dress up like other ideas. And I think we've dressed up Indians to be something that we understand.
That's the thing that I wanted to ask you. You've done extensive work from the 70s onward.
Yeah.
You've published a number of books on native California Indian culture.
Yeah.
And went back to people who had connections all the way back before, California was settled by white people. What conception of Indian culture did you feel you were overcoming then? In your memoir, you mentioned the lack of academic training on your part was a benefit. Not being an anthropologist helped a lot.
Yes, that was great.
Yeah.
That was great.
What did you have to overcome at that time in terms of how Indian culture was understood, and how do you see it still being interpreted?
I think that the Indians were victims, and I think there's a sense of elevating the victim and creating a kind of model of purity, a model of
the noble savage sort of thing.
Yes, it was the noble savage sort of thing, and it's just and I think that there was so I think the people that I knew when I got into this thing in the 1970s, the people around that had been brought up by people that remembered California before the gold rush, and there were people that were just stunning, their nobility, their sense of humor, their sense of connectedness, their sadness was so great, their violence was there. They were into witchcraft. They were into poisonings. They were so good. And the latter part of it has been forgotten. There were raunchy women that would talk about sex, and it was so fun to talk to them about sex. Yeah. And yet everybody's starting to clean up their act. And I think they're trying to make Indians safe for the fourth grade curriculum. They're trying to create this image of people that did nothing but make baskets and pound acorn and thank Mother Earth every day.
Yeah, live in peace and harmony with the world.
Peace and harmony. Yeah. And I can learn nothing from people like that. Mm-hmm. I think that piety sickens me. Yeah. And what I learned from people like Bernice Torres, who once tried to poison me, and she tried to witch me, and she's standing in front of me, and she's looking at me with her eyes, and she's singing this Pomo song. My name is on your lips, my name is on your tongue, my name won't leave your lips, my name won't leave your tongue. And I'm terrified. This Jewish guy from Boston is standing there, and she's trying to get me. And finally she stops in frustration and says, if only I had a lizard skin, you'd be mine.
Yeah, how much does this correlate with the evil eye in our various Jew curses and culture?
Yes, Kina Hardy.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's there. Mm-hmm. It's there. And it's a sense of how the world works in ways that are so visceral. There's that underlying sexuality and violence to the world and this fact that we've dressed Indians up to be perfect victims, I think does them a disservice, and I think we can't learn anything from people like that. So what I want to do is get beyond the dress code. and I think what I had to overcome was the basic fact that I'm a stranger to this culture, that I'm not part of it, that I have no right to speak for it. And it took me 40 years of getting to know people and developing tremendous friendships in this world. My relationship to the Indian community is not that of a scholar. It's a friend of the family, but it's also friendships. And I've got friendships in this thing that are so damn deep, and people I'm so devoted to. So,
I'll tell you, growing up in northern New Jersey, the town was settled in the 1740s, and the town handbook I had when we were little kids, you get this whole short history of the town. It was a hunting ground for the Lenni Lenape Indians. They weren't settled in this area, but this is where they hunted. And the handbook had the unfortunate text that with the arrival of the settlers, the Indian way of life in the area had to come to an end.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that was how it was portrayed to us again as fourth graders.
There was a necessity and an inevitability to it, because there was a hierarchy of civilizations, and this was a little lower on the scale, and we were higher on the scale. And the law of this world is that the higher on the scale takes over from the lower on the scale. And the Bronze Age takes over from the Iron Age and leads to the Atomic Age. Okay.
I'm just wondering, again, when you talk about legacy and what you've produced, I'd wondered how much you see yourself as a motive force in these things. How important do you see yourself, I guess, in the process of what you're making? I know there's a degree of self-effacement where, I'm just bringing these stories back and such, but how important is Malcolm to both what you've done and to the impression that you make on the world?
Well, nobody else has done quite what I've done, so there must be something in this Malcolm that's doing it.
Yeah.
I think that that book that you read, that Kim Bancroft did, the parts that have been left out of it was her attempt to figure out what made me who I am.
Yeah.
And
we can figure that out here. So go on.
Yeah. if you write me a note if you figure it out, I'd love to find out. I have no idea what happened to me. I have no idea. I think it may have been those 16 days of LSD that I took in a row, and my wife said that changed me forever. And it may have been those years of living on beaches in Canada and Mexico that were between college. It was after college and before kids. It may have been the era, but I don't know.
Yeah. But it wasn't Harvard. That's what you're...
No, it was not Harvard.
Good. Okay, because, you're the only guy I know who can go more than 2 minutes without saying that he went to Harvard. So that's.
Oh, yeah?
Usually it's a way it gets wedged into any conversation with anybody who ever went there. I did not go there.
So where did you go?
I went to Hampshire College.
Oh, you did? My daughter tried. My daughter spent a year at Hampshire, and she found out there were not real hippies there.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a degree of, again, sort of what you're talking about with perfect victims.
Oh, yes.
Everybody had to be a victim of some form of repression or another, and I found that very repressive in its way. So I went to St. John's as my antidote to get the whole Western civilization, great books, culture, which I probably should have done in reverse order. But there's a degree that making yourself a victim or an object is sort of.
So talk about Hampshire. Did they speak Yiddish in your house?
No, they formed the Yiddish book after I left.
No, in your house when you were growing up.
Oh, when I was growing up. I'm first generation American.
So am I.
Oh yeah, that's right. I was. Remember your family came over. Mine came over in the mid '60s.
They did. That was late.
Yeah, my father was born in '38 in Romania. And his father ended up in a camp, got out. They became refugees in '47, got to Palestine shortly before independence. Mom was born in 1940 in London in time for the Blitz. So
Hey, Phil, you've earned your neurosis.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They both come from a post-war
Yeah.
mentality as Jews. Their conception of America is a lot different than preceding generations' ideas might be. So yeah, I come at it with a certain degree of, well, you can't really complain because my grandfather was in a camp and my father was, hidden basically under the floor planks of a boat when he was 7 years old. So not getting the video game I wanted for my birthday doesn't really measure up. It's one of those, my mom had a Mickey Mouse gas mask for when they were worried about the bombs coming in. And yeah, again, growing up in suburban New Jersey, we were sort of a terminal point of history, I think.
So my wife was born in Warsaw in 1940. Her father was in Dachau. I don't think this was mentioned in the book. I think we left this part. These are some of the parts that were left out. Yeah. And I grew up in this crazy narrow world of xenophobia, and I can romanticize it. I can talk about the pieties of things. I can talk about the Beth Midrash, the study halls in the old temples. I can talk about these things. I can talk about it with.
So yeah, knowing the Jewish culture.
So I grew up in it. My wife was not Jewish, but she grew up. Her mother died in those wars. Her father was in Dachau. Came out crazy, and I resolved when we had kids that we wouldn't pass a lot of this stuff on, and that we'd be the shock absorbers. And I absorbed whatever pain I could from this old world, but I did my kids free of it, and I did. And my kids are beautiful. And so in some ways I regret, there's the irony that I've been so active in preserving other people's cultures and languages, and I've let my own go.
Did they show any inclination towards it?
Hell no.
When you're a kid, and you brought up the same thing that I went through, you don't want to go to Hebrew school when you're a child. You don't want more hours in a class. Don't. But in their adult lives, did they ever look back and, kind of wonder about Judaism or just the culture?
Yeah, they wonder about it. But so there's that wonderful story that was told of Bobby Kennedy when he was running for senator in Massachusetts, and there was there was a factory, and it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they'd set up some kind of a bandstand for him to talk on, and the factory workers pour out of the factory, and he's addressing them, and at the end he says, are there any questions? And somebody raises their hand and says, is it true you've never had a job in your life? And he says, I'm afraid it is, and somebody else yelled, you haven't missed anything. So I think in a way I brought them up in a different way, but they're productive, they're happy, they're full of art, they're full of life. They're reproducing our kind. But it was a conscious decision not to pass this. And I'm not a Jew-hating Jew. I'm not at all. But what it bore with it was this xenophobia, this fear of others. There was something about its sentimentality. There was something about its being the chosen people was not my idea of a good life. I did not want to be chosen.
Although you do have the Hasidic beard. I'm kidding.
It started out as a hippie beard.
Yeah.
And as I've grown older, it's become rabbinical.
We could do a little pay-us on But again, the culture didn't... was there a sense of the not wanting to fit in that you felt both growing up and as you got older, not just with the greater world, but that narrower Jewish culture that you would have been growing up around?
Oh, I didn't fit in at all.
Yeah.
But I think I had to create a world around myself to fit in. Mm-hmm. And I could never fit into anybody else's world. The one job I had at East Bay Regional Park District, I got fired after 3 years. I just couldn't fit in. And so I think I had to create my own world. I could have worked for somebody else. I'm putting on airs. I could have worked for somebody else if I had to, but I didn't have to.
Yeah. I've got a lot of friends who fit into that boat, who just melt down in job after job because they can't quite do it, but they don't take the leap that you did, which is to build your own world. Berkeley? What brought you here? What keeps you here?
So...
I mean, I know the story from your memoir, but really, what is it about this place?
Accident.
Yeah.
When my first kid was born, we settled in Berkeley because it had a library, because I had some friends here. And we planned to move on. I didn't really like it that much. It was kind of college town, and it wasn't very beautiful. But it was a place where we had some friends, and I needed a library to do some research. And so we settled in, and the kid was sick for 3 years, and I got a job. And so I've been passing through now since the late 1960s. So I think it's partly been accident. But there's a wonderful thing that, do you know the East Indian writer Chitra Divakaruni?
Nope.
She's Bengali descent. She's I think she teaches at the University of Houston now, and she's a marvelous writer.
I'll look it up, but yeah, we'll try to figure it out.
I'm having trouble with this one. Chitra Divakaruni.
Just like it sounds.
Yeah, Chitra Divakaruni, and she's the funniest goddamn person I've ever met. And so what she talked about was how in America you fall in love and get married. In India you get married, and then if you're lucky you fall in love. I think that I moved into Berkeley as a kind of forced marriage. We needed a place to live, and the love for it came gradually. And the love for it came from associations with people, with place. It's been so good to me. I love my role in this town, and I love the people that I know. And I love there's been something about the utopian visions of Berkeley. And it can be cartoonish. There was a columnist, Herb Cain, who had the greatest comment on Berkeley of all time. Mm-hmm. And Herb Cain said, "Poor Berkeley, too small to be a city-state, too big to be a lunatic asylum."
For those of us outside the blast radius, yeah, there is a stereotype about this place, and I'm sure you guys are comfortable perpetuating.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
We work hard to keep it going.
How's it changed over the almost half century?
Of course.
How is it transformed?
I think that what we're going through now is a kind of development was becoming Manhattanized. And yet, I love Manhattan. And I think if it's going to become Manhattanized, we better make this the best Manhattan in the world.
Yeah.
And I think there's a chance of doing it. So there's been something about when I came here. I remember I came here, my friend Richard Teitelbaum, who I knew from Harvard, was studying at Cal. And he brought us down. We took a tour of Berkeley, and we came down west of what was then Grove Street, which is now Martin Luther King Jr. Way, and we came into this area of small houses, one-family houses with lawns. He says, "This is the ghetto," and I say, "This is the ghetto. If this is the ghetto, I just reached heaven." But you could come here, and I think that our rent when I first moved here was $90 a month. Mm-hmm. And we could pick up food for, I think, lamb necks were 23 cents a pound. You could pick up food scraps from the supermarket if it said you had a rabbit. And so we'd pick up old vegetable scraps. We'd make stews. I could support a family of 3 on a part-time minimum wage job for several years. And it gave you tons of time. It's now become more expensive. Young people don't have that option, or they don't feel they have that option. It was that world of communes. And I think, and I see this one coming back. I see young people. Are you in touch with many young people?
No, I hate everybody younger than me.
Oh, you do?
Because of the lack of success, really.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the one thing I've learned from doing this show for a couple of years is that I really enjoy talking to people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, much more than I enjoy anybody under the age of 50. So it's a weird discovery, but I found that people who've actually seen cycles go by are more interesting than people who still think they're a beautiful, unique snowflake. So,
oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Hey,
but your experience with the young?
I think whoever made young people had a great idea.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about, that there's a naivete. And for a while I saw it covered over by a sort of defeat and cynicism. And when I talked about the 60s, people would not want to hear it. Mm-hmm. They did not want to hear about the freedoms that we had, about the hope that we had about the community, about this sense of spending days in the park, getting stoned, and making love, and there'll be something. They just got tired of hearing people talk about the '60s. They're no longer tired about hearing it, and I think there's a craving for it. I see it coming back in various people's worlds. There's a commune up the street that I visit every so often as a kind of elder, and I'm sure it's not going to work. It didn't work the first time around. It's not going to work the second time around.
But you still have to try. That's...
Oh, yes, you have to try. Yeah. And you have to see what comes out of it all.
Do you feel that's a dress code also? The 60s perception, a sense of idealizing what was there? Or do you find it's more an honest take on what life was like when you explain it to people? Do you have to dress it up in a way that the kids will get it?
I lie naturally.
Okay.
So, and that book that you've been looking at, Kim Van, I brought it home to my wife. She said I got everything wrong.
How's that?
The stories that I told, I twisted them around to make better stories out of them.
But that's what stories are.
Yeah, this is exactly what I feel.
Yeah.
So I may be twisting the '60s around to make it a better story, but that's my job. Mm-hmm. Did you ever know the poet Phil Levine?
No.
So Phil Levine lived in Fresno.
You make me feel incredibly unread, which is pretty impressive because most people get intimidated because they think I've read everything. But good. Phil Levine.
So Phil Levine was poet laureate of the United States at one point, and he was a Fresno poet. He was known for the poetry of work, and was sitting around with a bunch of poets, and they're talking about how with poetry you can be yourself. With poetry you can tell what you truly think. With poetry you can be your true self. And Phil looks with complete contempt, and he says, "Why be yourself when with a little bit of effort you can be interesting?"
Yeah, there's this Norwegian writer, Knausgaard, who's got this giant self-involved novel, which apparently is fantastic. Haven't read it. My fear is that it's going to lead more Brooklyn writers into writing about themselves as opposed to anything interesting.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of get that feeling that it's wow, I now have license to just navel gaze forever, which to me, not so interesting.
So let's talk about this interview that we're having. You want to talk about me? I'm going to try to talk about the world.
Sure. I basically my questions are revolving around retirement, legacy, etc., and all of those feed into how you see, this world around us.
So the way I think one of the big changes that I've seen in my life has been the growing dominance of salesmanship in everything we do. So it's infiltrated our language. We now sell each other things. We don't know how to talk without selling each other something. We're selling each other ideas. We're selling each other ourselves. We're selling each other nature. We're selling each other.
We sold the country on war.
Yes, we sold the country.
It was literally phrased in those terms in 2001, 2002.
And the very structure of our language is aggressive and it's salesmanship. Do you know the wonderful poet W.S. Merwin?
Yeah.
So he was a good friend. He's still alive. He lives up in Hawaii. But he has this marvelous poem in which he says, "I want to talk of the forest. I will have to speak in a forgotten language." And that forgotten language is not the language of salesmanship. It's the language of embrace. It's another use of language. And I think what I get around hanging around Indians is this a sense that the world is bigger than our capacity to understand it. So there's a humility to it, the world. And with Western culture, I think we use language to dominate and to conquer. And we use and the sciences are used to define, to limit, to conquer. With Indians, I think they use language and knowledge to define wonderment, there's something about, so there was this marvelous alcoholic linguist named Jaime de Angulo who lived in Berkeley. He was one of my favorite writers. Mm-hmm. And Jaime de Angulo, at the end of his life, he had testicular cancer. He was dressing up as a woman This was in the 1950s. He was dressing up as a woman and to pick up other women in lesbian bars, which is so highly evolved. I mean, this is a sexuality that I thought I had widespread knowledge.
Yeah, and then you realized, no, that's a quirk I hadn't come up with.
Yeah, and I had no idea how it could work, but he was completely crazy. At the end of his life, he had this correspondence with Ezra Pound, who was in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, being treated as, he pleaded insanity after the Second World War. And these two crazy old men had this correspondence in which they're talking about their lives and their vision of the world. But Jaime had this marvelous, he worked among the Achamawi, Atsugiwi people of Pitt River country in northeastern California. And he was up there and he was talking to some guy, and he says to this guy, he says, "Can you tell me the history of the world? Like, how was the world made?" And the guy says, "I'll tell you how the world was made. In the beginning was Coyote." And Jaime says, wait a minute. I was talking to somebody in Dixon. They says in the beginning was Silver Fox. And the Indian says, well, there they say it was Silver Fox. Here we say it was Coyote. And he went on. In Europe, you would have had a religious war in which 3 million people would have been killed.
Right.
But there...
Here, yeah, you say Coyote, I say Silver Fox.
And there was another part of that. This is such a great interview. It was in a book called Indians in Overalls. And in another part of that interview, he's talking about how world makers want. So Coyote wants to. So I think it was world makers making the world and wants to do something. And he says, "I better not do this because what will people think of me?" And Jaime says, wait a minute. There's no people. Nobody. He can make any kind of world he wants. What does he mean? What will people think of me? And the Indian says, when I was a kid, I wondered about that. I asked my father. My father said, when I was a kid, I wondered about that. But the ends are not tied up. There's a looseness to this world. And there's a way of seeing the world. So there's an anthropologist named Keith Basso. And Keith Basso worked among the Apache. He spoke the Apache language. And he was working with Apaches on a sense of place. And I think that what I've loved about him dealing with Indians is this sense of place. And this has become a cliche in our world because we don't understand it. But we our culture ends up taking knowledge and it structures things around a sense of time. We have history. So we have one thing led to another. We have causality. We have institutions that we keep track of. We have constitutions. We know the history of the Senate. We know the history of we have genealogies. Indians had none of that. The past time was flat. And the way they structured their knowledge was around place. And places had stories. And you go with some Indian, and I remember going out with my wonderful friend, Cody Pata. And Cody Pata would talk about how that grove over there is where such and such a clan had collecting rights. That tree over there in a previous age, when people were marched from their homeland to Round Valley Reservation, people died along the way. That tree was alive then. It was a witness tree. And we still go to these witness trees because they witnessed this tragedy. That rock over there in a previous life was a person. And that rock over there, as a person had married that mountain over there and gave birth to Hummingbird. And it's these wacko myths that make no sense to us whatsoever. And the whole world was filled with stories. And these stories talked to one another. And your sense of who you were was not based on history. It was based on place and relationships. And it was a story that mixed time in the most marvelous way. So so Keith Basso. So Keith Basso was out with this Indian guy, and they come to a sacred place, and the Indian guy tells him the name of the place. And Keith Basso, who could speak Apache fluently, tries to pronounce it and can't quite get it. So the guy repeats it. Keith tries to pronounce it and can't get it. The guy says it a third time. Keith tries to pronounce it and can't get it. The Indian guy says it a fourth time. And finally, Keith says, hey, listen, I've got it on tape. Let's just continue. The Indian was mortified. This is the name that Worldmaker gave the place. If you don't have time to say it right, what the hell are we doing here? And there's that sense of saying it right. There's that sense of stories that adhere to different places. And Berkeley, for me, is filled with stories. When I think of Berkeley, I think of Kaufman's Fabrics. And Kaufman, and it was this store at the corner of University and Shattuck. It was a fabric store at the corner of University and Shattuck Avenue. In the 1950s, blacks had moved into Berkeley from Richmond, from the shipyards, and they were moving up toward the central shopping district of the town. At the same time, a tunnel had been built through the mountains, so there was white flight to the suburbs, and the merchants of downtown Berkeley were terrified. The blacks were moving in, the carriage trade was moving out, and they thought they were going to lose it all. So they had a meeting, and Kaufman was there, and Hinks from Hinks Department Store was there, and Houston from Houston's Shoe Store was there. The Harvest Brothers from Harvest Brothers Sporting Goods were there. Rochester from Rochester Electric was there. Palmer from Palmer's Camera was there. All these places, this middle America world of people that had individual stores, in this pre-chain world, were there. And they thought about how to preserve the downtown. And they figured they could preserve the downtown by not hiring any blacks. And if they didn't hire any blacks, then it would keep the blacks wouldn't feel welcome. And Kaufman got up and he says, "I'm a Jew and I know where that's going to lead. I'm hiring blacks."
And that sense of history wipes away over time.
Yes, it does. But I think these are the stories that we need to preserve. And this is true heroism for me. This is not somebody fighting for justice in a distant place. This is somebody who stood up among his own people, among his own. He risked his economic well-being. He confronted people around him. He confronted them on this point of vulnerability about being a Jew. And he was just a great old man.
Yeah, there's a degree of, and I get this with some older gay guests that I've had. There's a sense of young people today don't understand what we had to fight for.
No, they don't.
What we went through, and yeah, again, I don't know if that's something you're able to instill on these guys. If you don't understand, you're benefiting from all this stuff that we had to go through.
Well, you were talking about Henry Miller. So Henry Miller, my first job, I was a pin setter in a bowling alley. My second job was as a caddy in the Brookline Country Club. And one of the perks in there was the caddy shack. And the caddy shack had this caddy master who would get these books from Paris. And they were smuggling in Henry Miller. Yeah. And at that time, you couldn't read Henry Miller.
Yeah. The books not until 1961 or so, when they had the trial in Boston.
Yeah. Yes. So you couldn't read, and we'd sit around. I'd get in early so we could read Henry Miller. When it became legal, it was much less interesting.
That comes up again and again. There's a great interview with Philip Roth in the Paris Review a million years ago, where I think it was George Steiner he cites complaining that Western writers don't understand, and these writers in Eastern Europe and under the Iron Curtain, they're the ones who are the true heroes, and we should all live like this. And Roth was like, yeah, except for the fact that they all are desperately trying to get to the West to live just as banal as the rest of us. They really don't want to be, heroic and under fire all the time. But yeah, that sense of normalizing this and then losing, what it means, what we fought for, in a sense. Yeah, but that sense of history isn't just for you, not limited just to Indian and non-white culture. You also look at it in terms of Berkeley and just how the commerce has changed and how the...
I look at it for whatever makes a good story.
Yeah, what we get sold and what we try to hold on to.
Get sold?
What we get sold. The stories that were sold as fact, but the ones that really matter, that don't fit the sales pitch.
So there's a wonderful story of... Do you know the story of the rabbi that performed miracles?
I know some stories of rabbis who perform miracles, but probably not the one you're thinking of.
It was somebody who lived, I think, at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, and he lived it must have been somewhere around Lvov in the Ukraine, and not far from Chelm. And it was a rabbi that was reputed to do miracles. And he would go out to a place in the woods, he'd light a fire, he'd pray, and he'd dance. And he He would sing and dance and pray. And throughout his lifetime, miracles were performed. The rabbi died. His replacement is chosen. The replacement is in the study. There's a knock at the door. Rabbi, there's a fever has hit the town. The children are burning up. It looks like some kids are going to die. We need a miracle. And the rabbi performed, before you did miracles, this is your job. You got to get us a miracle. So the rabbi goes out to the woods. He lights the fire. He dances and he sings, but he doesn't know the prayers. So he says, I've come to the right place. I've danced and I've sung. It'll have to be enough. And it was enough, and the fever broke, and the kids were saved. He has a long life, many miracles. His successor comes in, and the successor was sitting in the study. There's a knock at the door. Rabbi, locusts are coming. They're hitting the buckwheat. They're hitting the rye. They're decimating the fields. We're going to starve this winter. We need a miracle. The rabbis before you perform miracles. You've got to give us the miracle. So the rabbi goes out into the woods. He lights the fire. But he doesn't know the dances. He doesn't know the songs. He doesn't know the prayer. So he gets out there and he says, I've come to the right place. I've lit the fire. This is all I can do. It'll have to be enough. It was enough. Flocks of seagulls come. They eat the locusts. And the village is saved. Long life, many miracles. Dies, successor. Knock at the door. Rabbi, Cossacks are coming. They've been burning towns. It's been pogrom. They've been killing people. They're coming down the road. They're heading toward us. We need the miracle. They leave. The rabbi says, I know that there's a place. I know that there are prayers to be said. These have been lost for a couple of generations. There are songs and dances to be done, but I don't know those. There's a place you're supposed to go to light the fire, but I don't know where to go. All that remains is the story. It'll have to be enough. So it was enough. And the moral that was given for that story was God created people because he loved a good story. But I think it was more than that. It was the power of a story to form, to retain a kind of knowledge that can't be retained otherwise. And I think I do a whole lot of environmental work, and I hate environmentalists. I think they're the most moralistic, rigid fucking people I've ever met. And this business of separating plants into good and bad, this business of doing right and wrong, I have no use for it all. But what I feel we have to do I feel my battle is the human imagination, and this is it's not. And I think these environmental battles are won and lost in the human imagination before they're won and lost on the land. And I think the way to the imagination is with emotion, with stories. And it's obvious I'm an emotion junkie. Mm-hmm. And if I can get through a few hours without breaking into tears, it's a wasted day. I think one of the most lovely things that happened to me was she's not here today, but this gorgeous woman that I hired named Lindsay Bear. And I hired her to run a California Indian publishing program. And she'd been working here for 6 months. And I said, after 6 months, I said, is there anything you'd like? And she says, yes, there's one thing I'd like. And I said, what's that? And she said, I'd like to get through one day in this fucking place without breaking into tears. And they're not tears of frustration, they're tears of emotion. Because the people that we're working with, the revival of languages, so we got this guy working for us named Vincent Medina, who has relearned the language of the East Bay. It's been extinct for 75 years. He relearned it from wax cylinder recordings that his ancestors had left behind. He speaks it fluently. He's teaching it to others. This is so heartbreakingly beautiful to hear this language. And we've been part of, I helped create this program for reviving California Indian languages. And to have people get up with these marvelous sound systems, the marvelous musicality of different languages, the grammatical cleverness of our species, to be able to express so much in so many different ways, and to hear these people get together and relearn languages that have been dead, or pass languages on that were down to their last speakers, is quixotic and it's beautiful.
So the question of succession, like the rabbi.
How
do you find someone who keeps up?
So the guy that's going to replace me is Steve Wasserman. And Steve Wasserman is a major world figure. He was book review editor for the LA Times. He created the Los Angeles Times Festival of the Books. He's an editor at large for Yale University Press. He's worked for large publishers. He's Linda Ronstadt agent. He was Susan Sontag's good friend. Christopher Hitchens was his friend. And he's a major figure. And he grew up in Berkeley. He's now in his early 60s. He wants to move back. He's taking KD over. And he'll take it to some other place. It'll be a different place.
What was that process like for you, though? Just the finding yourself willing to pass something on to somebody.
It was pretty mixed.
Yeah.
And I was not as gracious and graceful about it as I could have been. But I think that the place had gotten too big for me. So I started out doing my own books, and I started out to be independent. And I never wanted to work for anybody. As it grew larger, I found myself more and more dependent upon board and funders and staff, and we finally reached the $2 million mark in sales and in income. And when you're a nonprofit and you reach $2 million, you have to get audited. So we got audited for the first time in 40 years. Closet doors opened up and skeletons came out.
How were you accounting for this? Yeah,
and it wasn't.
I would say you're not living up to your Jewish heritage, but maybe you.
Oh, yes, I am.
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
In the
I am indeed.
Never pay retail Jewish heritage.
So my Jewish heritage was a small town.
We can stereotype because it's just us, so it's okay.
Yeah. So you never buy retail, and I remember going with my uncle Milt. There was a social thinker named Murray Bookchin. Did you know about Murray Bookchin?
No.
Murray Bookchin. He was prominent during the 60s and 70s as a social thinker, and he was talking about the ennui that comes about with chains and with this loss of community, and people whose work was part of their lives, and the personal contacts that you had. In some ways, this has been a heyday for me. It's been a way of meeting people. It's been my way of getting to know people. It's been my way of. It's been the horse that I've ridden into valleys. It gives me entry into any place in the world, and I love that entry, and I love the range of that entry. I can go into Jerry Brown's office. I can go into a reservation. I'm welcome everywhere because I've got something to give to this pop-up. But he was talking about how these chains have changed everything. And I remember when I was a kid, if you wanted a pair of shoes, I had to go to a friend of my Uncle Milty's who never had, and you could never get the shoes that were in style. But
these ones fell off a truck.
Yeah. My Uncle Milty was into stolen overcoats. And I think I think he may have been a fence. But
join the club. My old man used to sell hot electronics back in the 70s. So yeah.
Oh yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Again, we have a stereotype.
Well, it was valid.
Yeah.
But I remember when I discovered Tom McCann shoes that they were cheaper than what my Uncle Milty's friends were selling shoes for. You didn't have to go at 9 o'clock at night to somebody's house. You could get the style that you wanted. It was cheaper, and you didn't have to put up with all that bullshit. And there was something about the anonymity of this world that I loved. I think what's coming out in me is a kind of contrariness, and it's a kind of rebellion against a constant theme that I'm hearing as I'm talking to you is that things aren't what they seem, that the Indian world has been transformed into something that it wasn't, that so one of my heroes, I think it was from W.H. Auden, maybe. There was some guy named Desmond the Destroyer, who destroyed one-of-a-kind objects. I love Desmond the Destroyer. I think there's great. I think there's a liberation in destruction that I just love. One of the stories that I tell about my California Indian life was, so there were these roundhouses around California, and these are ceremonial houses, and every decent village had a ceremonial house. And it was here that dances were held. There were hotels for guests. There were religious, there were churches, there were cathedrals, there were universities. It was the big public house of any village. And roundhouse culture existed for thousands of years in California. And in the town of Ione, which is near the foothills of the Sierra, there was the famous Ione Roundhouse. And there they talked about how the great Pedro Connor would come and tell stories. And these stories would go on for 4 days. And there were stories that had to be told in the right way. And there would be grand dances that would be done for ceremonial times. And my wonderful old friend, Bill Franklin, grew up in the 1930s as a dancer and singer in the Ione Roundhouse. He then went into the Second World War as a soldier. He came out, and the roundhouse had collapsed. Roundhouse culture in California collapsed during the Second World War for a number of reasons. And he then went off and he became a logger. And he was a choke setter for some logging company. And he built a suburban house in a place called Shingle Springs outside of Sacramento. The 40s came, the 50s came, it got into the 60s, and he suddenly realized that old world was gone. That world that he remembered so well and he kept waiting for it to come back, but nobody was bringing it back. So he decided that he would try to bring it back to some extent. He built a rec room next to his suburban house, and he then got the local Indian kids. They went out there and got roadkill, flicker feathers and deer skins, and he remade the regalia, and he'd get the kids into that rec room and he'd teach them the dances and the songs. Around the late 60s, he figured he'd try to build another roundhouse. So he got together with this guy, Glenn Villa from Ione, and Harold Burris from Jackson, and a couple of these other old-timers that had been dancers in these old roundhouses, and they rebuilt a roundhouse. That roundhouse was built in 1970. It was at Chaucer, a place called Chaucer. And it became the Woodstock for California Indian life. You'd end up having these ceremonies would go on, and all the people from the surrounding towns that didn't have their own roundhouse would come there, and the dances would go on for 4 days, and you'd have they go on all night, and you'd be there at 3 o'clock in the morning, and some scraggly group of people from some shattered little nation would come in to bless a kid, to consecrate for death, the stuff that you had to do when somebody died, and for all these ceremonies that use this roundhouse. So it was and they'd have an annual big time that I'd go to, and it was ecstatic. So it was built in 1970. In 1990, the roof collapsed, and they rebuilt it. It then went on until about 2010. The roof collapsed again. They rebuilt it. It's still going strong. So I was once talking to Dwight Dutchke, who was Harold Burris's grandson, and I was inquiring about how it was built. I was inquiring about how the door was oriented. It was oriented toward the east. Was there a reason for that? Was it to get the rising sun? And there was a door on the back, and through which they bring the firewood. And was this in the old times, or was this a concession to modern practice with the code problems? And I'm talking to him about how the rafters were strung, and I'm interested in the technical business of how a roundhouse is built. And he finally gets impatient. He says, "I know what you're getting at, Malcolm." I said, "What am I getting at?" He says, "You're getting at the fact that we didn't build it too good." I said, "Shit, no, Dwight. That's not what I'm getting." He said, "We didn't. We're into construction. We know that you don't put posts in the ground without creosote, without drainage. There was nothing in the old rules that said we couldn't use creosote or provide proper drainage, but we didn't do it. We tied the rafters with grapevine. There was nothing in the old rules that said we couldn't use metal. We could have used metal, but we used grapevine instead. And we know that if you want a roof to last, you don't tie it up with grapevine. But there was another rule that we had to follow. I said, what was that? He says, you have to build a roundhouse so it falls apart every 20 years. That way every generation knows how to rebuild it. So for me, this is in part an answer to your question about heyday and succession. I feel that I built it up and I created something out of it. And I think that it has to be torn down again. And I think it has to be looked at afresh. And I think that its component parts have to be rebuilt. And I've been staying out of the place. I've been letting it happen. I think that for me to become the old guy that has this moral force and ends up becoming increasingly out of step with young people, I think my successor is going to come in. He's already made some good mistakes. I had 40 years of making mistakes. I don't want to rob him of that experience.
What were the books that made you?
The books that I read?
Yeah. What made you? I mean, you mentioned the only one that comes up in the memoir, at least in the first half, is Make Way for Ducklings. But beyond that, what were the books that you felt helped shape who you became?
So there was a series, it wasn't a book, there was a series of magazines that Robert Bly did. Do you know the poet Robert Bly?
Yeah.
So he was something of a friend. And he did
Is that a veiled, frenemies thing?
No, it's not.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
No, it's not. I haven't seen him in years, and the friendship was never that close.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I remember going out for dinner with him and the poet Jonathan Logan, and I was so thrilled to be going out with the great Robert Bly, and I was so thrilled to be having dinner with Malcolm from Dorchester, just going out with Robert Bly and Jonathan Logan, and I approached that dinner with such anticipation I was going to learn the truth, and I was going to get all these insights. So the two of them promptly got drunk and didn't say a goddamn thing. And then at the end of the meal, Jonathan looks up at Bly and says, Robert, I'm going through some big changes. Robert says, what's that? And Jonathan says, I'm writing in longer lines. So Bly had this series of magazines. In the 50s, it was called the 50s. In the 60s, it was called the 60s. And there was one issue for the 70s. And I came upon it late. I came upon it in the 70s. And I read it all as if it were one book. And that one really was a tremendous influence to me in terms of the poetry that was in there, but in terms of Bly's commentary on it and Bly's capacity to introduce new ways of thinking, and it introduced me to so many great writers, and that really opened my eyes. Another thing that influenced me greatly was the Whole Earth catalog, and this was a whole new way of doing things. It was a whole new way of seeing things. Stuart Brand ended up giving me the money that started Heyday. And
did you ever pay him back?
Hey, yes.
Okay, I just wasn't sure if there was
not in terms of cash.
Okay, that's what I'm wondering.
It was a grant.
Yeah.
So it was not an investment. It was a grant. Yeah, I've done a few things for him over the years. Yeah. And then another book that influenced me was, so when I got kicked out of college and I was living in New York and depressed and unsure of myself, I picked up this book by Cyril Conley called Unquiet Grave, a word cycle by Palinurus. And it was, I looked at it recently, it was the most gloomy, goddamn self-involved thing, but I couldn't get over it.
You were like 20.
Yeah, I was. And Palinurus was the night pilot. This is night pilot. Mm-hmm. And there's this marvelous line in Odysseus, in the Aeneid, in Virgil's Aeneid, where Palinurus, there's the voice of, there's a jaunty iambic pentameter meter in the Aeneid, and then there's that voice that is a kind of narrative voice. And Palinurus was haunted. Palinurus ended up dying. He was never given proper burial. His soul wandered forever, and there was something doomed about him. So, he was the night pilot. And when night fell, Aeneid would hand over the tiller to Palinurus, and this voice comes out of nowhere. and you're not sure who's speaking it, but it comes out of nowhere. Te palinore patens, tibi somnia tristia portans in something. Searching for you, Palinores, bringing you sorrows which you did not deserve. And there was something about that loneliness that I felt at that time, the voice of Palinores, and these quotations that were so defeated and self-involved, but I think it got me through some difficult times. Another book that had tremendous influence was a book by John Muir, but not John Muir the naturalist, John Muir the Volkswagen mechanic. And John Muir was this guy. He lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he had and he wrote a book called How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive: A Repair Manual for the Complete Idiot. Yeah. And so when I came out west, I bought a VW bus for $300 in Queens. We came out west, and I learned how to fix this thing. And there was something about the confidence that this inept Jewish kid who didn't know how to change a light bulb could end up taking out motors and stuff like that. I think gave me the courage to create Heyday books. That it gave me the courage to learn typesetting and design. That it gave me that there was something that I felt I could learn something, and it was a tremendously influential book. What are some of your books?
The Iliad more than the Odyssey.
Oh yeah,
Orwell's collection of essays. I don't know what it is. Why I stick with the Iliad over the Homecoming.
The Iliad was. I think the Greek literature was so much better than the Roman literature in general.
Yeah. I only discovered the Aeneid. Well, I only read the Aeneid a few years ago because having gone to St. John's College, we were very Athens-centric. And so the Romans were sort of seen as lesser and secondary. And so I finally sat down with Ovid and Virgil and realized, I should have read this back in my 20s. It would have been a lot more useful than in my 40s. There's a book I'm going to give you as a gift if you haven't read it already. I haven't had time to pick it up. It's called Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. If you haven't read it yet, it's this wonderful novella about ostensibly about chess. But it's really about trying to make a world for yourself in the face of a very, very ugly time. The Leopard by Giuseppe Lampedusa. I only read that a few years ago, around the time I was 40. And that was my my moment of, thank God I have a life where I can feel as though my life has just been changed by a book, which I wasn't entirely sure I was still that person. Then I read The Leopard and thought, oh my God, thank God I got to read this before I died. I need to read this again right now. Montaigne's essays. I worked my way through those beginning to end and blogged about it, which was a very strange process. That also, I think, helped make some of who I am at this point. But Orwell's essays, it was really Orwell and Henry Miller back when I was 19, 20, 21. Tropic of Cancer and Orwell's conversation with that, and then branching into more of Orwell's essay writing that sort of set me on my path. The second Whole Earth catalog, the one that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was a techno-utopian hippie guy. Now, of course, as you've seen, I'm cleaned up and a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh, you're boasting.
But we were promised virtual reality back in 1989. It's taken them 25 plus years to get there. But the whole science fiction world, I was part of the whole cyberpunk thing. I cared a lot about once upon a time.
Do you know Ursula Le Guin?
No. I read a few of her things when I was much younger, but I haven't in later days. I know.
You know Kim Stanley Robinson?
I read, was it the Mars books?
Yeah.
Yeah, I read all those back, probably when they came out, like early 90s, I guess.
If you want to interview Kim, he lives in Sacramento.
Yeah. Yeah, but it was the same thing with the person I interviewed yesterday. She mentioned 5 people who live near her up in Fairfax, all of whom sound like tremendous guests, including like Victor Moscoso, one of the great. And that to me is one of the when you ask about books, I always pair off the comics because the comic books meant an awful lot to me in different ways than prose books.
Are these underground comics?
Generally, I started as a superhero kid when I was young.
Of course, we all did.
Yeah, and then I got to college and I discovered everything I didn't get about looking at Robert Crumb's artwork. Suddenly, oh no, wait a second. Okay, this is a lot better than the X-Men, and I started getting twisted in that direction. It's at a point now where I'll go interview Bill Griffith. I'll sit down. We had 2 great conversations last year. But
good.
A mutual pal though asked me if I wanted to interview the DC Comics, writer for the Green Lantern, who's now like shepherding their movie stuff. I'm like, I have no interest in that person. I wouldn't even know how to talk to someone who spends their life doing superhero comic books. That's maybe I'd find something interesting, but sitting down with Bill and hearing about how you do Zippy the Pinhead as a daily strip for the last 30 years, that to me that means a lot more. So yeah, the comics are almost a secret history of me. So that's part of who I am. The books, the comics, the self-absorbed superhero freak in my teenage years, back when things were angsty and dark. And now there's a sense of I don't want to say joy. Yeah, joy. Joy.
You seem to be in good shape.
I seem to enjoy things. I've learned to let things go.
Yes.
Which I think is the great lesson of middle age, and something I try and convey to younger people who are still worked up about things they can't control. And you don't want to be condescending, because I'm sure you go through the same thing. You don't want to tell them, don't worry, someday you're going to see this all.
I'm not sure I feel that.
Yeah?
I'm not sure I feel my superiority to them.
Okay. Is there a degree, though, you feel you have a sense of perspective that they don't have yet, just in terms of having seen a lot more go by?
I suppose if I think about it, yes. But in my actual dealing with them, I so respect their vitality. I so respect their youth. I so respect their openness to possibility and the sweetness of soul. And so I think, I'm not sure I know anything you couldn't talk me out of in 5 minutes.
I should mention, by the way, in keeping with the books and the life thing, again, I'm here for a biotech conference, but I come in for 2 days before that so that I can sit down with people like you and have good conversations. I'm doing this biotech thing. I'm flying on a red eye to Washington so I can give a presentation. And after that, I'm going to my grad school alma mater to have a 4-day seminar about Anna Karenina.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, I'm going back to St. John's. It's the
good
annual
for you.
thing.
So you've kept this thing alive.
That's the thing.
Hey, good for you, fella.
Because you have to. If I only had work, if you're only defined by the job, that's not life, I don't think. But,
so I when I was out with Juan Felipe Herrera, we were talking about recess and the need for recess.
Yeah.
And then we got into the fact that we both hated recess. It was the dominance of these.
Because the jocks would
the jocks would dominate you, and it was the love of the jungle.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the concept of recess, of having some place that the mind can retreat to with their great thoughts, and there's that other way of thinking. Yeah, good for you.
What do you want to be remembered for?
I think I'd like to be remembered for what I've done for other people, the people that have prospered around me, and I think that, I've given other people, as a publisher, as a friend, I've given other people a place where they could prosper, and my kids have prospered, and I admire most about people like Ishmael Reed and others is the fact that other people have prospered around them. I think that I come into this place, so I love the people that work here, and I love watching them come in and become themselves, drop their professional air, their professional pretense. I love hearing their kitchen voice, hearing who they are. I love getting to know them well, and there's something about I created a few other things. I helped create the Alliance for California Traditional Artists, which is an art organization, a folk art organization that I co-created with a couple of people, and we had Dan Sheehy on the board from Smithsonian Folkways. We had Beth Lomax Hawes, who was Alan Lomax's sister. We got her on the board. We got Hugo Morales was originally on the board. Hugo was head of Radio Bilingue. I had Nari Cano, who was the foremost mariachi player in the world. And we had Charlie Seaman from the Western Folk Life Center in Elko, Nevada, that does the cowboy poetry readings. But it was an excuse to hang around Cambodian dancers and to hang around taiko drummers and to hang around people into folk arts. And so I think I would love to be remembered for that. I keep thinking that if I had something on my, if it were to be this mythological grave, and something would be on the headstone, it would be, he was easy to please.
I think we'll finish with that.
Okay.
Malcolm Margolin, thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
And that was Malcolm Margolin. He does not have a website, but you can find out more about Heyday Books by visiting heydaybooks.com. And that's HEYDAY books.com. You can also just search for Malcolm Margolin, and that's Margolin, and you'll find a ton of neat articles and interviews about him and his work. A few years ago, Heyday, as I mentioned, published an oral history called The Heyday of Malcolm Margolin, The Damn Good Times of a Fiercely Independent Publisher. And that was written by Kim Bancroft. It includes oral history. It's got stories from Malcolm, the people he's known over the years. There's excerpts of some of the books he wrote and the news from Native California, the quarterly magazine about, it's by and about California Indians. It's a really, really neat book, and it's, it gives you some idea of the life that you just got to listen to. Now, after the main conversation, I asked Malcolm, so, who are you reading? Now, besides that David Malouf book, if you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show, and that'll give you access to our monthly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, where we go into the, who are you reading with that month's guests. You can do that at patreon.com/VMSpod or at paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for supporters of the show, including that podcast, patron-only blog. You'll get the list of all the books that Malcolm and I talk about this episode. I'm also hoping to do a series of ebooks. If we get a high enough level of support every month, I can start getting some of the conversations transcribed, turn those into ebooks, and I've got a charity tie-in idea I'd like to do with that, but we'll see. Anyway, go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. And if you don't like Patreon, just go to paypal.me/VMSpod and make a donation that way. If you do, you'll get access to the exact same material through our sister site, fearofasquareplanet.com. Now, as far as support goes, special thanks go out to our key supporters, Paul W. Jones, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Zach Martin, Kyle Peterson, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the show. We've got a full list of supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. This episode was recorded at the Heyday Books offices in Berkeley, and that was part of a pre-trade show trip. So I paid out of pocket for a night at my hotel, car rental, gas, parking in Berkeley, but the airfare was a work expense, so, some of that balances out. But still, if you want to help defray some of my costs to do this show, please visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. David has a reunion project going with his great 80s band, David and David, and made the album Welcome to the Boomtown. You can find out more and support the Reunion Project at facebook.com/DavidandDavidMusic. And that is it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with a conversation with the great cartoonist M.K. Brown, also recorded during the San Francisco trip. Until next time, you can subscribe to the show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can follow the Virtual Memory Show on Twitter at vmspod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for this podcast. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Until next time, you have been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.